You stand mere inches from a silent, gaunt figure propped by trembling servants in the dim, musty air of Greenwich Palace. You can taste the coppery tang of his blood as he coughs up dark, foamy sputum, greenish yellow, streaked with clots, the stench of decay pressing into your nostrils. His breathing comes in rattled gasps, each wheezing breath sounding like a death rattle. Before you, the boy king, barely 15, lies wasted to skin and bone, his limbs swollen, mottled, and impossible to ignore. Some say too blackened. Putrefied ulcers festered in his lungs. They burned like silent fire, eating away at his breath, at his very life. And in that haze of agony, you bear witness not to a legend, but to suffering laid bare. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and what you're about to remember may never leave you again. If this glimpse into suffering and lost greatness stirred something within you, if the cold reality of history grips your mind, subscribe and like. Let the shadows of the past haunt more minds. Truth laid bare without comfort. Stay if you dare to see how power slips through the hands of a boy. How pain becomes history. You find yourself transported to mid-16th century England, a land caught between tradition and upheaval. It is 1547. On one fog-choked January day, the enormous figure of Henry VIII fell silent, and from the ensuing silence rose his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, crowned King of England and Ireland. You are present in the great halls of Hampton Court and Westminster, watching as a frail boy, raised among Tudors and regents, inherits a kingdom torn by religious reform, social unrest, and famine. You are not the boy. You are the quiet observer in a great court, your breath held in anxious suspense. The realm is breaking with Rome. Protestant preachers call in English where Latin once resounded. Rebellions flare across the countryside in 1549. Cries of "No Mass" and sacrilege filling the air, Cornish and Norfolk men rising against radical change. You sense the tinder of unrest, ready to ignite. Guardians, first his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, then John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, rule in his name. You hear whispered debates of theology and power, the delicate dance between sovereignty and regency. You are conscious of every scent, the faint tang of incense in chapels torn down, the acrid smoke of bonfires burning priests' images, the polished woods of court chambers. Of every sound, the rustle of silk gowns, the hushed reading of Protestant homilies, the clang of armor as rebellion is put down. You feel the boy king's presence, his brilliance staggering, fluent in tongues, fierce in theological conviction, devouring scripture even as he remains child small and fragile. The contrast is striking. Edward, the Protestant boy king, intelligent beyond his years, yet surrounded by ominous portents, childhood illnesses like quartan fever, a form of malaria, and smallpox and measles in 1552 that left his body weakened, susceptible to worse. You watch his life as though observing a candle's flame flicker near a draught. Each cough, each pallor, tells you change is coming. Why is this story so terrifying? Because it's not myth, it's the slow, creeping annihilation of potential. A monarch whose every breath is borrowed, slipping from vibrant influence to silent wastage. And you are here to witness it, as the fever tightens its grip on him in early 1553. You sense dread deepen. The bright crown begins to feel heavy, a weight laid upon broken shoulders. The social fabric of England strains with uncertainty. Who will follow? Will Mary, Catholic and impatient, reverse all Edward built? Will the realm be torn yet again between king and kin, faith and power? This is no distant legend. This is pain, decay, and political terror entwined in the body of a child. And you stand in that room, bearing witness. You are in the royal chamber at Greenwich Palace in January 1553. The air heavy with the mingled scents of beeswax, rushlights, and something darker and acrid. almost metallic odor that clings to the back of your throat. It has been months since the boy king, Edward VI, first showed signs of illness, and the transformation in his body is stark. His skin, once pale with the healthy translucence of youth, is now drawn tightly across his cheekbones, hollowing his face until his eyes seem too large for his head. When he moves, if he moves at all, it is with the fragile stiffness of a frame too weak to bear its own weight. You watch from a shadowed alcove as the physicians hover, their black robes whispering with every cautious step. Their tools are simple: pewter bowls for bleeding, linen cloths for poultices, and an assortment of herbal concoctions whose sharp, resinous smells cut briefly through the cloying atmosphere. They speak in low tones, debating the course of the disease. Phthisis, one murmurs, tuberculosis of the lungs, the slow rot that devours from within. Another suggests suppuration, an abscess eating away at the tissue, its poison spreading. You note the unease in their eyes. There is no cure in this time, only the grim patience to watch and wait. It began quietly, almost innocuously. In the spring of 1552, Edward had recovered from smallpox and measles that winter, two trials that left his body weakened but his mind still sharp. He had returned to his studies, delighting in theology and classical languages, dictating his own chronicle of events. Yet sometime in January 1553, his cough worsened, first dry, then productive. It shook his thin frame until he clutched his ribs. The phlegm that stained his handkerchief grew thicker, streaked with red. You see him press the cloth to his lips now, lowering it quickly, as if hoping you did not see the fresh bloom of crimson there. The court is unsettled. Rumors creep along the corridors faster than any servant's step. Some whisper of consumption, the wasting disease that lingers for months, even years, hollowing its victims. Others fear it is something more acute: pleurisy, pneumonia, perhaps a combination. The physician's notes preserved from that time, along with later accounts like those of chronicler John Fox, describe a relentless decline marked by coughing fits, fever, and shortness of breath. You see it for yourself, each inhalation shallow, each exhalation a rasp. Outside the sickroom, the machinery of power grinds on. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, dominates the Privy Council, ensuring that his influence over the young king remains unbroken. You walk the long gallery and overhear talk of succession, quiet at first, then sharper, more urgent as Edward's illness deepens. His half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, stands next in line, followed by Elizabeth, the Protestant yet cautious daughter of Anne Boleyn. Northumberland's own ambitions grow visible. His son Guilford Dudley is wed to Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin. The stakes are as high as the crown itself. But within Edward's chamber, politics seems far away until you hear the boy speak. His voice, though weakened, still carries the authority of a king. He dictates his devise for the succession, bypassing Mary and Elizabeth, naming Jane as his heir. You are close enough to smell the ink as it dries on the parchment, to see the tremor in his thin hand as he signs. The act is both defiance and desperation, born from the conviction that England's Protestant reforms must not be undone. It is also the last major decision he will make. The disease advances without pause. By early June 1553, Edward is confined almost entirely to bed. His cough becomes more violent, his chest heaving with each paroxysm. Chroniclers record that the matter he voided was of a greenish-yellow color, with blood intermixed, and very fetid to smell. You can confirm it now. The odor is putrid, seeping into the rush matting beneath his bed. At times, the stench is so strong that servants open the casement windows, letting in the warm, damp air of summer, along with the faint tang of the Thames. His limbs swell, a sign of dropsy, fluid retention, perhaps from heart strain or systemic infection. The once quick step of the boy who hunted with hawks in the palace meadows is gone. He cannot stand unaided. His skin is mottled in places, the veins beneath visible as bluish lines. In the flickering candlelight, he looks less like a living king than an effigy, a pale waxwork set upon pillows. By July, the sound of his breathing fills the chamber at night, labored, wet, rattling deep in the lungs. You are there when the Archbishop of Canterbury visits, offering prayers. Edward's eyelids flutter as he listens, lips moving silently to the words of Scripture. His faith is unbroken. He clings to it as tightly as to the linen sheets drawn up to his collarbone. Outside, the court whispers of his inevitable end, but inside, there is only the measured agony of hours stretching into days. On the morning of July 6, 1553, the change is sudden. His breathing slows, the long pauses between each gasp stretching wider. The light through the high windows casts a pale glow across his face, catching the sheen of sweat on his brow. You lean closer, hearing him murmur a final prayer, "Lord, save me," before his chest stills. The silence that follows is heavy, absolute. The body remains in state for hours. Physicians examine him, their fingers pressing gently at the sunken abdomen, the wasted limbs. There is no embalming. The heat of July quickens decay. By the third day, the sweet sick odor of putrefaction is unmistakable. The court hastens the funeral preparations. On August 8th, Edward is buried in Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony led by Archbishop Cranmer in the Protestant rite. You stand among the mourners, the air thick with incense that cannot fully mask the memory of that other smell. And so the boy king is gone, dead at 15. His reign lasting barely 6.5 years. You have seen him rise to the throne as a child and waste away before your eyes. His body consumed by disease. His will bent toward one final political act. In the shadows of Greenwich, you have borne witness to the slow extinguishing of a life that carried the weight of a kingdom. You stand in the echoing stone corridors of Westminster, the news of Edward VI's death still fresh in the air like the toll of a funeral bell that refuses to fade. Servants, courtiers, and clerics pass in hurried steps, their eyes lowered, their words hushed. You can feel it, the tension that clings to the walls. Thicker than the damp summer air, the boy king's body lies behind closed doors, guarded by men who do not meet your gaze. You know what they know. England is now in dangerous uncertainty. The first hours after his death are not consumed with mourning alone. You can hear the scratching of quills in council chambers, the murmured readings of documents in the Duke of Northumberland's hand. Edward's device for the succession has been enacted. Mary and Elizabeth are excluded. Lady Jane Grey is named Queen. You remember seeing her before, a young woman of 16, pale-faced, earnest, and unwilling to wear the crown she has been maneuvered to take. In these moments, you understand how the boy's death has opened the door to a political storm. Still, your mind drifts back to the last days of his life, the physical reality that no council record can soften. By the week before his death, Edward could barely swallow. Accounts note that his appetite had vanished entirely. Whatever little he consumed seemed to return in bouts of retching. You recall the sound, low, painful, the cough and the gag almost indistinguishable. The linens had to be changed more than once a day, soaked with sweat and sometimes the foul-smelling sputum that marked the end of tuberculosis. The royal physicians, Thomas Wendy, George Owen, and others, were powerless. They prescribed the remedies of the time, cordials to strengthen the heart, syrups to soothe the throat, and bloodletting to balance the humors. You remember the glint of the lancet, the crimson arc into the basin, the boy's pale hand gripping the bedframe as though it could anchor him against the tide pulling him away. None of it slowed the disease. If anything, the draining weakened him further. Outside the palace, the city moved under the heat of July. The Thames carried barges heavy with summer goods. Fishmongers called their trade on the banks. The smell of tanned leather and the tang of human waste mingled in the streets. But here, in these rooms, the air was sealed, the silence oppressive. The boys' windows were covered with heavy drapes to keep out the glare and the noise. A single shaft of light sometimes broke through, catching on the silver-gilt frame of a portrait of his father, Henry VIII. You notice how the king's painted eyes seem to follow the bed. A ghostly presence of expectation and failure. The attendants who bathed Edward did so quickly. Fearful of moving him, they spoke later of the way his body felt, light, almost insubstantial, yet with the swollen ankles and knees of dropsy. His ribs pressed against the skin, each breath making them rise like the bones of a cage. You recall one servant, an older man who had served Henry VIII as well, muttering under his breath, "No king should go like this." You are there when Archbishop Cranmer comes to hear Edward's confession. The room smells faintly of beeswax candles and something sour, the scent of decay that no one names aloud. Cranmer kneels beside the bed, speaking softly. Edward's lips move in reply, forming prayers. His voice is little more than a whisper. But you catch one phrase, "Lord, take me to thy mercy." There is no weeping, no outward show of fear. Whether it is faith or exhaustion that steadies him, you cannot tell. The day he dies, the transition from life to stillness is marked not by drama, but by an absence so sudden it startles you. His final exhalation is long, trembling, and then nothing. The room remains still, except for the sound of a clock somewhere in the distance. Those present bow their heads. The curtains are drawn fully now, casting the chamber into dim half-light. The smell of his body changes quickly, sweet, cloying, unmistakable. You follow. Days later, when the coffin is prepared, there is no embalming. England's climate and the heat of that summer make it impossible to delay long. His body is wrapped in fine linen, placed in a lead-lined coffin, then into an outer wooden shell. Heralds and officials stand in formal ranks as the coffin is closed, the hammering of nails echoing in the vaulted space. The air in the hall is thick with incense, meant to cloak the odor that rises when the coffin is moved. On August 8, 1553, you stand at Westminster Abbey. The funeral is a Protestant service, conducted by Cranmer. The coffin, draped in cloth of gold, rests before the high altar in Henry VII's chapel. You watch as the mourners file past, nobles in black, their hoods drawn, their expressions carefully schooled. There is no great wailing, no theatrical grief. The service is solemn, almost austere. The choir sings in English, the new liturgy of the Reformed Church Edward had defended so fiercely. When the coffin is lowered into the vault, you lean slightly to see. The ropes creak, the wood disappears into shadow. Dust drifts from the ancient stones. You notice the flicker of torchlight on the faces around you, some grave, some unreadable, some already thinking of the battles to come. For Mary, the half-sister Edward sought to bar from the throne, is already moving to claim her right. Within 9 days, Jane Grey will be deposed, and Mary will be queen. But in this moment, all of that is outside. Down here in the cool stone belly of the abbey, the boy king's life is over, sealed beneath layers of stone and history. You are struck by how quickly the human body surrenders to time. The slender fingers that once held the scepter are now stilled forever. The keen eyes that read Latin and Greek blur into memory. Around you, the scent of extinguished candles mingles with the damp mineral smell of the crypt. As the mourners disperse, you remain for a moment longer. You think of how brief his reign had been, 6 years in which he never ruled entirely on his own, yet left an indelible mark on England's religious course. You think of the irony that his death, meant to preserve Protestantism, will instead lead to its temporary suppression under Mary. You think of the wasted potential, the fragile body carrying the burden of a realm, When you finally step outside into the August air, the sun is low, throwing long shadows across the abbey's west front. The city hums beyond, indifferent to the loss of one boy among thousands. Even if that boy wore a crown, you walk away knowing you have seen not just the death of a monarch, but the erosion of a young life under the twin forces of disease and power, a sight that will not leave you. You are back in January 1547, long before the sickness claimed him, when Edward VI first became king. You see him not as a dying boy but as a solemn child walking in the shadow of a colossal figure, his father. Henry VIII, now lying cold in his tomb at Windsor. The court is draped in black, yet within weeks, preparations for the coronation begin. You stand at Westminster Abbey on February 20th, 1547, as trumpets blare, banners unfurl, and the slight, fair-haired boy ascends the throne of England and Ireland. The ceremony is remarkable in its symbolism. Unlike previous coronations heavy with Catholic ritual, Edward's has a distinctly Protestant tone. Archbishop Cranmer speaks of the young king's role as a reformer, urging him to root out superstition and uphold God's word in English. You watch the boy kneel, the crown lowered onto his head. His face is unreadable, his blue eyes fixed on something beyond the vaulted ceiling, perhaps already feeling the weight of the crown's burden. In the years that follow, you observe him closely. His mind is sharp, his education rigorous. Tutors like Sir John Cheke and Roger Ascham drill him in Latin, Greek, and theology. He reads with a voracity that leaves older men impressed. You are there when he debates the finer points of Protestant doctrine with bishops. His voice clear, his conviction unwavering. Even as a boy, he records in his own hand a chronicle of his reign, factual, spare, and precise. It is a habit that will leave historians with a rare insight into a Tudor monarch's mind. But behind the scholarly brilliance lies a political reality he cannot control. As you walk the corridors of Hampton Court, you hear the shifting tones of authority. First his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, ruling as Lord Protector, then John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, skillfully taking power after Somerset's fall. These men use Edward's legitimacy while pursuing their own agendas. You notice how decisions are made in council chambers without the boy's direct voice, yet when religious matters are at stake, Edward insists on being heard. You witness the sweeping changes, the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, the removal of altars, the destruction of stained glass depicting saints. The scent of burning wood and stone dust lingers in churches across the land. In Norfolk, you stand at the edge of Kett's rebellion, the air thick with the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and fear. Men shout for the restoration of the old religion and relief from economic hardship. You feel the tension in the realm growing like a wound that refuses to heal. By 1552, the boy's health begins to falter. You notice it first in the way he tires easily during hunts, or how he coughs after speaking at length. That spring, he contracts measles and smallpox, 2 blows in quick succession. His recovery is partial at best. The court physicians note that he emerges thinner, paler, and more easily winded. You begin to see the shadow of mortality creeping in, though no one dares speak it aloud. In early 1553, his cough deepens, his appetite wanes. You remember the day he appeared before the council, wrapped in a heavy fur-lined robe despite the mild weather. His cheeks are flushed not with vitality, but with fever. He tries to speak at length but is seized by a fit of coughing that leaves him breathless. Clutching a handkerchief streaked with blood, the sound echoes in the chamber long after he leaves. Still, his mind remains clear, even urgent. In April, he begins drafting his devise for the succession. You are close enough to see the determination in his face as he dictates the exclusion of Mary and Elizabeth, setting aside the established order for the sake of his Protestant faith. He is already ill enough that the effort leaves him exhausted, but the document is completed, signed, and sealed under the watch of Northumberland and the council. By May, his decline accelerates. You watch him struggle to stand during audiences, his legs trembling under his own weight. Physicians record swelling in his limbs, likely dropsy, alongside the relentless cough producing foul-smelling sputum. The odor in his chamber shifts from the beeswax and herbs of daily life to the sickly sweet stench of infection. Servants open windows when they can, but the summer air brings little relief. June brings no improvement. The sound of his breathing has changed. It is wetter now, as though each inhalation pulls through fluid. Some observers write of suppurating ulcers in the lungs, details consistent with advanced tuberculosis or severe pneumonia. You see the boy's once bright eyes dim with fatigue. When Cranmer visits, Edward clings to scripture, reciting psalms in a voice that wavers but does not break. You are there on June 30th when he appears for the last time in public, at least in spirit, carried to a window overlooking the palace gardens. He waves weakly to a small gathering below. From this distance, his frame looks almost translucent, as if light could pass through him. The crowd's cheer is muted, uncertain. You can feel it. They know their king will not see another summer's end. By the first week of July, he is bedridden entirely. The final hours you have already seen, but remembering them in the light of his whole reign, they feel different. You realize how much was forced upon this boy: the religious revolution, the politics of succession, the burdens of rule, all on a body already destined to break. When he dies on July 6, 1553, England loses not only a monarch but a promise. You stand again at the side of his bed, recalling the coronation day 6 years earlier. The same thin hands that once held the scepter now lie still atop the linen. Outside, the machinery of politics moves swiftly to crown Jane Grey. Inside, you are left with the image of a boy who bore the weight of a kingdom, only to be consumed by an illness no physician could stop. You find yourself once more in the cold corridors of Greenwich in the first weeks of 1553, when the signs of Edward's approaching death are too clear to deny. The palace, once alive with the sounds of courtiers and the clatter of daily life, is subdued now. The only constant sound is the boy king's cough, wet, rattling, echoing faintly against paneled walls. You walk past the door of his privy chamber and catch the faint reek of sickness seeping through. A mix of sweat, phlegm, and the medicinal herbs the physicians keep burning in shallow brass bowls. The court physicians try everything their training and the time allow. They bleed him to reduce heat in the body. They apply poultices of mustard seed and vinegar to his chest. They give him broths infused with comfrey, licorice, and syrup of violets. You stand nearby as these ministrations are carried out, watching his face tighten in pain or simply turn away in exhaustion. None of it stops the decline. His breathing remains strained. His lips are tinged with blue, the pulse in his thin neck rapid and shallow. In the evenings, the smell of burning juniper drifts down the corridor, an old belief that its smoke can purify the air. You can see the resinous haze curling toward the ceiling, but it cannot mask the odor rising from the boy himself. Dropsy has bloated his legs and feet. The skin is stretched and tender, and sores have begun to form where the flesh is most swollen. The servants who wash him do so with the tenderness one might show a child. Their voices lowered as if speaking too loudly might snap the thread keeping him in this world. Edward remains mentally sharp, dictating small notes and memoranda from his bed. You hear him request updates on foreign affairs, on the progress of the navy, on the state of coinage. He asks for religious books to be read to him, often the Psalms, sometimes the writings of reformers. The voice that reads to him is steady, but yours catches at moments, for you can see how he clings to these words as his body betrays him. By June, the cough produces more than blood. There is greenish, foul-smelling pus in the cloth he presses to his mouth. The odor, described in later accounts, is the unmistakable stench of rotting tissue within the lungs. Chroniclers would note this as a hallmark of suppurating tuberculosis, though in Edward's time the nature of the disease was still cloaked in mystery and fear. You stand close enough to see him glance at the stained cloth and turn it under quickly, as if ashamed. The council comes often now, but their visits are not merely to comfort. You overhear discussions between Northumberland and other councillors in the antechamber. Their voices urgent. They speak of Mary, how she must not inherit the throne, how the Protestant faith Edward has defended could be undone in months. Edward, pale against his pillows, insists to those who will listen that his devise for the succession must be honored. You realize that this boy, racked with disease, is still fighting a political battle even as his body collapses. Outside, the summer presses in. The heat lies heavy over London. The air in the Thames side streets is thick with the smells of fish stalls, tanneries, and the waste that flows into the river. But here in the palace, the heat feels trapped, oppressive. Servants open windows at night, hoping for a breeze, but sometimes it only brings the stink of the city inside. Flies find their way into the chamber, buzzing lazily near the bed before being swatted away. You are present when the archbishop visits again, bringing communion. Edward's hands are so thin now that the veins stand up like cords. The wafer rests briefly on his palm before he manages to raise it to his lips. His eyes close, and for a moment there is a stillness, a calm that seems almost to erase the weeks of agony. But then the cough returns, shaking him, forcing him to turn aside. His breathing afterward is shallower, more deliberate, as though each breath must be planned. As July begins, there is a marked change. Edward's waking hours grow fewer. He drifts into long periods of sleep from which it is hard to rouse him. When he is awake, his mind wanders briefly before he focuses again. You can see his ribs move sharply under the skin with every breath. The rest of his body still except for the slight swelling and sinking of the chest. The day of July 6th begins quietly. You are at his side when the room's light shifts, and the shadows on the wall lengthen. Edward whispers something you cannot catch, his lips forming silent shapes. You lean closer and hear, "Lord, have mercy upon me." There is no struggle in his last breaths, only a slowing, a pause, and then an absence that fills the room. The silence is almost physical, pressing against your ears. Within hours, the room changes. The attendants move with new purpose, drawing curtains, covering mirrors, placing candles at the head and foot of the bed. The air begins to shift in scent, still the medicinal herbs, but now joined by the unmistakable sweetness of the first stages of decay. They lay his body out in the state bed, hands crossed over his chest, face pale and still. You look upon him and remember the boy in the coronation robes, the keen scholar, the determined reformer. That image already feels distant. In the days that follow, you accompany the slow progression toward burial. The coffin, lined with lead, is brought into the chamber. The clanging of the nails being driven into the wooden shell echoes up through the rafters. On the day of the funeral, August 8th, you stand in the abbey as the Protestant rites are read. The coffin is lowered into the vault in Henry VII's chapel, the ropes creaking under the weight. Incense thickens the air, but you know it is not only for ceremony, it is to cloak the memory of what you smelled in those final days. When the service ends, you remain in the abbey long after the others leave. The cold stones under your feet and the dim candlelight make it feel as though time itself has slowed. You think of how short his life had been, how much had been demanded of him, and how quickly the boy who was a king has been reduced to a name in a chronicle. You are in the council chamber of Whitehall Palace, the summer heat pressing in. When word spreads that Edward VI is dead, the great oak table is ringed with men whose faces reveal little, but whose eyes shift constantly, calculating the next move. There is no pause for grief. The succession must be secured. The parchment of Edward's devise for the succession is unrolled. Its ink still dark from the boy's own trembling hand weeks earlier. Lady Jane Grey is to be queen. You remember Jane, slight, pale, serious beyond her years. She is married to Guilford Dudley, Northumberland's son, and has been drawn into the web of politics that Edward's death has tightened. You can sense her reluctance. But in these halls, reluctance matters little. On July 10th, 1553, she is proclaimed queen. You are there as she enters the Tower of London, dressed in fine damask, the crown's weight still theoretical upon her head. The cheers from the crowd are muted. Uncertainty hangs in the air. But beyond the court's walls, Mary Tudor is already moving. She is at Kenninghall in Norfolk when the news reaches her, and she acts swiftly, rallying support from nobles, commoners, and Catholics eager to reverse the Protestant reforms Edward had championed. You can almost hear the hoofbeats of her messengers carrying proclamations through the countryside, summoning men to her cause. Inside the tower, Jane's reign is short-lived. You overhear whispers among guards and courtiers, reports of Mary's swelling army, of towns declaring for her. The council begins to shift. Loyalty bends toward the side most likely to prevail. It is a process you've seen before in Tudor politics, sworn oaths dissolved by the scent of power's changing tide. On July 19th, Jane is deposed without battle. Mary enters London in triumph, greeted by bells and crowds, the air thick with the scent of trampled grass and the smoke from celebratory bonfires. You stand on the edge of the procession, watching as she rides past, her face composed, her eyes fixed forward. The Catholic Mass will soon return to England. The work of Edward's short reign is already under threat. Yet even in Mary's victory, Edward's memory lingers. The new queen orders his burial rites respected, but she makes no public display of grief. The official accounts preserve his image as a virtuous, godly prince, yet to you, who saw the truth, that image feels incomplete. You remember the wasted body, the bloody cloth, the smell of decay in his final days. You know that beneath the polished lines of the chronicles lies a reality few have faced directly. In the weeks after Mary's accession, the court changes rapidly. Altars are restored, Latin returns to the liturgy, and the familiar scent of incense fills the chapels once more. You notice the difference immediately, the heavy perfume replacing the simpler, sharper smells of Protestant worship. Statues and crucifixes, hidden or destroyed during Edward's reign, are brought back into view. It is as though the boy king's reforms are being buried alongside his body. But his death also leaves a void beyond religion. You hear merchants in the markets worry about the stability of the coinage. Soldiers grumble about their pay, and scholars debate what will become of the English Bible Edward had promoted. His absence is a reminder that the monarchy can be fragile, more fragile still when the crown rests on a child's head. In the autumn of 1553, you visit Westminster Abbey again. The abbey is quieter now, the tourists of court life gone, the banners from Mary's coronation already fading in color. You descend into Henry VII's chapel, the air cool and faintly damp. You stand above Edward's tomb, marked simply, without the grand effigies his father had commissioned for himself. The stone is smooth under your fingertips, cold as the memory it holds. You try to recall his voice, his manner, the look in his eyes when he dictated his final will. What comes instead is the sound of his coughing, echoing in the silence of the chamber. Later, you overhear older courtiers speak of Edward in guarded tones. Some praise his piety and learning. Others remark on his firmness in matters of religion. A few admit, in low voices, that his youth and illness made him a pawn in greater games. You have no need for speculation. You saw the way those around him shaped his reign while his body weakened. The city moves on. By 1554, Mary's rule is solidifying, and Jane Grey is executed. The Protestant cause Edward had fought for is suppressed. its leaders exiled, imprisoned, or burned. You think of how quickly the legacy of a life, especially a short one, can be altered. Edward's reign becomes a brief chapter, overshadowed by the turbulence before and after. Yet in quiet moments, you recall the boy as he was before illness claimed him, walking in the gardens at Hampton Court, discussing scripture with tutors, his mind quick and curious. You remember the pride in his bearing when he spoke of reform, the conviction that faith and learning could shape the kingdom. And then you remember how that same kingdom, in the end, watched as he wasted away, powerless to save him. Years later, the records will try to make sense of his death. Some physicians' notes suggest tuberculosis, others chronic pneumonia complicated by measles and smallpox. Modern historians tend toward the diagnosis of advanced tuberculosis. Given the chronic cough, the bloody sputum, the wasting, and the swelling in his limbs, you do not need the verdict. You saw the disease with your own eyes, felt its slow, merciless erosion of his life. What remains with you most is the contrast, the grandeur of coronation against the frailty of his last days, the ideals he carried against the political manipulation surrounding him, the stillness of his tomb against the noise of the living world above it. And perhaps most of all, you remember the moment the light left his eyes, a moment as small as a breath, yet large enough to change the course of a kingdom. It is now years after Edward VI's passing, yet you still find yourself haunted by the memories of those final months. You walk again through the long galleries of Greenwich Palace in your mind, the windows casting pale light across the wooden floors, the air still carrying the faintest echo of a cough that once rattled those halls. You recall the boy king not in the flush of ceremony, but in the dim reality of illness, the fever-glazed eyes, the linen handkerchief blotched with blood, the shallow breaths that marked the steady march toward his end. You remember the court's unspoken rules during those last weeks. Never speak of death in his presence. Always offer the hope of recovery. Always treat the next sunrise as though it might bring improvement. But in the antechambers, you heard the whispers. The words, consumption, and decline, passed between physicians and counselors alike. Some spoke of God's will, others of the cruel fate that robbed England of its sovereign strength. You knew, as they did, that there was no path back. When you think of him, it is not only the physical suffering that comes to mind, it is the isolation. Even surrounded by servants, physicians, and counselors, Edward seemed alone in a way no one could bridge. The weight of kingship, the fear of God, the expectations of a realm, all bore down on a frame already too frail. In those final audiences, you saw how every visitor's words were measured, every movement controlled, as if the wrong gesture could hasten his fading. There are small details, too, that remain sharper than the great events. The smell of beeswax mixed with the faint tang of iron from the blood in his sputum. The sound of the Thames outside on warm evenings. A reminder that life continued beyond these walls. The way the light shifted across his face in the late afternoon. Shadows falling in patterns that made him seem even more gaunt. You remember the coldness of his hands when you brushed them by accident. The skin paper thin over bone. After his death on July 6, 1553, you followed the slow procession of decisions that shaped the days to come. The preparation of the body, the sealing of the coffin, the carefully managed funeral rites, each act performed under the gaze of a court already divided over who should follow him. You stood in the abbey on August 8 as the Protestant service was read, knowing that even as these prayers were spoken, the political tide was turning toward Mary and the restoration of Catholicism. You saw the swiftness with which Edward's work was undone, the Latin Mass returning to Westminster, the altars restored, the vestments of the clergy once more rich with gold embroidery. The books and homilies he had favored were gathered and removed. It was as though his reign was being folded away, sealed in a chest and hidden from sight. But you knew it could not be erased entirely. Too many had seen him. heard him, and felt the force of his convictions. In quieter moments, you think of the way Edward approached his own mortality. There was no recorded outburst of anger, no railing against God. Chroniclers like John Foxe would later depict him as steadfast, pious, certain of his salvation, whether this was entirely true or shaped by the needs of Protestant memory. You cannot say, but you recall his composure. The way he met each day's pain with a kind of calm that unsettled even his physicians. Historians centuries later would comb through the evidence, the accounts of chronic cough, the bloody sputum, the wasting, the swelling in his limbs, the fever, the sores. Most would conclude that tuberculosis, phthisis, as it was known, was the likely cause. It was an illness as old as recorded history, one that claimed rich and poor alike. For Edward, there had been no escape, no cure, no mercy in the speed of its progress. You sometimes return in your mind to the day of his coronation, when he stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey, the crown just lowered onto his head. The boy who would rule a kingdom looked every inch a king that day, robes heavy with ermine, face lit with ceremony, the crowd's cheers filling the air. The memory of that strength makes the image of his final days all the more stark. The crown replaced by a linen cap, the cheers replaced by the rasp of his breath, the grandeur replaced by the quiet of a darkened chamber. Even now, when you stand in Henry VII's chapel and look at the stone marking his resting place, you feel the distance between those two moments. The stone is plain, the letters worn. Tourists pass by without stopping, unaware of the boy beneath their feet who shaped a moment in England's history and then was gone before his manhood. You pause longer than most, letting the silence of the chapel settle around you, as if by standing here you can keep his memory from slipping entirely into shadow. What remains in your mind is not a single image, but a sequence. The first cough that drew his hand to a handkerchief, the first trace of blood, the shift from standing to bedbound, the day he could no longer eat, the night his breathing slowed and stopped, and then the days afterward, when the palace felt hollow, as though something vital had been torn from its center. You are left with the knowledge that kingship does not shield against the frailty of the body, that no crown can keep death from its course. And you remember, above all, that you were there, not as a tourist, not as a reader of history, but as one who saw the boy king waste away in pain, who breathed the same air, who stood close enough to see the truth in his eyes. You stand once more in the dim hush of Henry VII's chapel, the centuries having worn the stones smooth beneath your feet. The air is cool here, almost still, and the light that filters through the stained glass is muted, catching faint motes of dust that drift lazily in the space between you and the tomb. The name carved in the stone is familiar now, not as an abstract entry in a chronicle, but as someone you saw, someone whose breath you heard falter, whose hands you watched grow cold. The abbey is not silent. Far above, footsteps pass in the main nave, the faint rumble of a distant door opening and closing. Yet down here, the world feels separate, suspended between time and memory. You think of how quickly the days of Edward VI's reign passed, 6 years that began with a crown lowered on the head of a child and ended in the stillness of a summer afternoon. When his last breath faded into the thick July air, you recall the procession that carried him here, the coffin heavy with lead to slow the decay, the scent of incense filling the air to mask what could not be spoken aloud. You remember the way the choir's voices rose under the vaulted ceiling, carrying the new English liturgy he had defended. That was the final echo of his will, the last thing he truly commanded in death. Now, his legacy lies in a plain grave without grand effigies or gilded canopy. You rest your hand on the stone, feeling the cool permanence of it. The weight of years has dimmed the brightness of his face in memory, but it has not erased the truth you carry, that even a king can be rendered powerless by a sickness too small to see, too relentless to resist. As you stand there, you think of the contrast between power and the body that wields it. Edward had the authority of a realm but not the strength to outlast the fever. The coughing fits, the suffocating nights, the great matters of state, alliances, reforms, proclamations, were all dependent on lungs that could draw breath and a heart that could keep beating. When those failed, the kingdom itself shifted course. You realize that this is the lesson his life leaves you with. That crowns and titles are illusions against the simple, unyielding truth of mortality. The trappings of power, gold, silk, ceremony, cannot halt the slow erosion of flesh and bone. Every monarch, every ruler, every life eventually comes to rest in a place like this, beneath stone, beneath the weight of years. Above all, you remember that you were not just a bystander to a recorded death, you were there. You stood in the chamber when his breathing rattled in the night. You smelled the sharp tang of blood in his handkerchief. You saw the faint smile when scripture was read to him. You know the cost of his crown was measured not in coin or land, but in the years it demanded from a boy who never became a man. You step back now, letting the shadows reclaim the stone. The world outside the abbey will go on, crowds will pass, traders will shout, bells will ring, but here, the air holds the memory of a boy who ruled and suffered and was buried before his voice had fully deepened. Time will smooth the edges of his story, as it does with all things, but you carry it whole, the rise, the wasting, the end, and as you walk toward the light spilling through the abbey doors, one truth settles in your mind like a closing line carved into stone. All crowns are temporary, flesh is brief, but to witness is to remember, and memory is the only kingdom that cannot be taken.